The year was 1991. Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo were firmly entrenched in a console war for the 16-bit era, each of them with their own separate mascots. Whilst the Super Nintendo had Mario, Sega had Sonic the Hedgehog. The next genre that anybody talks about when they have a Super Nintendo or a Sega Genesis is the side-scrolling beat-em-up genre, and you have a plethora of games to choose from. You have the Double Dragon series, you have the Final Fight series, you have the arcade classics like Golden Axe, and you have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4: Turtles in Time. But this is not what we're going to be focusing on today. Streets of Rage, or Bare Knuckle as it was known in Japan, was released for the Sega Genesis in 1991 by the Sega Corporation. Now, unlike other games which had a legacy of being in the arcade, such as Final Fight, Golden Axe, and even Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4: Turtles in Time, as I mentioned before, they all were released in the arcade beforehand and were ported to consoles. So for the Streets of Rage to be successful, it had to compete with games that had been in arcade for years beforehand. So it was entering this fight completely unknown. And yet somehow, more people will talk about Streets of Rage to this day than games like Final Fight, which is a testament to the quality of this game. With Streets of Rage 4 coming out at some point this year, and with Streets of Rage also being one of my favourite gaming franchises of all time, it's one of the earliest games I remember playing as a child. I want to have a look back with a bit of nostalgia and some of my personal recollections, favourite memories, and hopefully I can transfer some of the love I have for this game to you in preparation for Streets of Rage 4 coming, and hopefully I can get you just as excited as I am about this. My name is James, from Square Go Gamers, and welcome to my personal retrospective of the Streets of Rage trilogy. Okay, let's kick things off from the very beginning. Streets of Rage 1. The Streets of Rage has a very basic plot of three ex-police officers, Axel Stone, Blaze Felding, and Adam Hunter, as they all went off on their own from the police force to battle against the evil syndicate run by the nefarious Mr. X, as he has taken over the city and violence has become norm in a once peaceful city. The evil tyrant ruling the city, mwahaha, you know, all that usual kind of plot that's pretty basic and standard for this era of gaming. So you go through the game, all 8 stages, defeat the game, beat Mr. X, and win the city, blah blah blah, game's over. However, what was interesting about this game, even way back in 1991, was there was an option to have a secret ending of, instead of just defeating Mr. X, when you beat him, you actually have a way of taking over the city yourself and becoming the bad guy, becoming the boss. But the only way to do it is by playing 2-player. So when you get to the final stage and you confront Mr. X with the two of you, he will ask each of you the same question, but one of you must say yes and the other one must say no. Then what will happen is Mr. X will throw a weapon in between the two of you and tell both of you to fight to the death to become his right-hand man. So whoever said yes has to win, and whoever said no has to lose. And when that happens, he will ask whoever won another question. Once you do that, you need to say no to him as a way of defying, like you want to take over his position and take his spot. And then you would fight him like you normally would at the end of the game. Once you do that and you defeat him, whoever you were controlling takes over and becomes the bad guy. It becomes the boss of the syndicate. It is a nice little Easter egg and adds a nice little touch of difference to the end of the game in a genre that wouldn't really have this kind of option. Because it needs to be 2-player and because it does need to be a very specific way of doing it, you have to know how to do it and you have to go out of your way to find it, so it can be a wee bit cumbersome. The game mechanics are pretty simple, as are most games of this kind of beat 'em up genre. Enemies can come from both sides of the screen. You have to beat all the enemies that are on the screen to move on. And almost every stage has a boss at the end of the level to test your skill, 8 stages in all. The only stage that doesn't have a boss fight is level 7, but there's an amalgamation of different characters in the elevator you go up, so there's plenty of challenge there as it is anyway. You get 1 special attack per life per stage, or you can get an extra pickup if you're lucky enough to find one in the level. All 3 characters are better at something than each other. So for example, Blaze is faster than everyone, but she's a little bit weaker. Whereas Axel is stronger, but he can't jump very well, and he can't do jump attacks the best. And Adam is as strong as Axel, and he can jump better than Axel, but he's slower than everyone else. So it really depends whether you prefer strong, slow characters or fast, weaker characters, or a nice little middle ground, which I feel as Axel is the best. personally. In my playthroughs of the game, even when I was playing this for the capture the footage for this, I've almost always went Axel. He's a character I always went as a kid, and I feel like most people are the same as well. But through my awkward teenage years, Blaze very obviously became a staple in the characters I can. Don't judge me, but you can't talk about Streets of Rage without talking about the soundtrack, and holy jumping techno Batman, that soundtrack. Composed by a band called Yuzo Koshiro. Koshiro was heavily influenced by EDM, or electronic dance music, specifically house and techno music. There's a lot of technical detail and information about how he managed to make the soundtrack sound as good as it does, but most of it, I'm not gonna lie, I don't really understand. It is quite complicated, the way he did it, and the tools he got to make it are. The main point being that Koshiro went out of his way to make sure the bass beats sounded as authentic as possible. And with many of the critics calling the trilogy's soundtrack some of the best gaming music ever made based on the style of the game, I'd say the hard work and the studying he put into it paid off pretty well. What can you say about Streets of Rage? It's a classic, and it's still fun to play nowadays. While the controls for nowadays seem a bit clunky and slow, still a lot of fun to play. Just grab a controller and lose a couple hours to this game, and you won't regret it. As kids, this was just so much fun, and it was just a great party game to be had. And as fun as this game was, we had no idea just how goddamn good the series would get from here. This is a masterpiece. This is the game everybody thinks of when they talk about Streets of Rage. This is a perfect sequel in my eyes. When I was given a Sega Mega Drive, yes, the Sega Mega Drive is what we called it over here in Scotland or the UK. When I was a kid, I was given 3 games: Kawasaki Superbikes, Sonic 3D's Flicky's Island, and Streets of Rage 2. This is the game that introduced me to the Sega Mega Drive, even before Sonic the Hedgehog was a thing. And oh my god, it's just as good now as it was then. Streets of Rage 2, or again, Bare Knuckle 2 in Japan, picks up 1 year after the first game. Mr. X has mysteriously returned, and this time, he has made it personal. Mr. X has kidnapped Adam Hunter to lure Axel and Blaze to him so he can enact his revenge. But this time, they haven't come alone. Adam's kid brother Skate and Axel's good friend Max head out to save Adam and destroy the Syndicate once and for all. Unlike the previous game, there's only one real ending to this game. You beat Mr. X and you rescue Adam and you kill the Syndicate. For now. And it's not a bad thing, because the gameplay is so addictive and so replayable that you don't need anything else. This game can be beat in an hour or 2, and I feel like any longer would just make the game drag out, and it's just a hell of a lot of fun as it is. With the characters this time around, there are 4 to choose from. You have Skate, who's Adam's kid brother from the first game. He's the fastest of all the characters, and he's also able to run, which is a first for any of the characters in the game, or the first game for that matter, but he's very weak. He's not a character I'm strong with at all. Then you have Max, who is a professional wrestler, and he's the kind of guy who looks like he would use Brock Lesnar to floss his goddamn teeth with. As you'd imagine, he's hella strong, but Jesus is he hella slow. Axel makes a return, and his stats are relatively the same, slightly weaker than Max, but he has the speed to make up for it. He's faster than Skate. And then you have Blaze. Judge me all like she's pixel perfection. She is perfectly balanced in all the stats, just like she's perfectly balanced. Personally, I love using the OG Alex and Blaze, but that could just be nostalgia on my part rather than anything else. But again, those are my personal favorites, and I've got friends who preferred Max or Skate to Axel and Blaze. Just depends on your preference. Everyone has their advantages and disadvantages. Everyone has a special attack if you double tap forward and then press the attack button at the same time. So for example, Axel has a firing blazing uppercut, or Blaze does a front flip attack. And this also adds a neat little move for catching enemies off guard and closing the distance between enemies, as sometimes you just need to get there faster, if you will. Also, it kind of spices up rather than just using the same combos all the time in special attacks as you did in the previous game. The best addition, in my personal opinion though, is the new powerful special attacks. When you press A on the Sega controller, or for me it was X on the Xbox controller, and you use one of two of your powerful attacks. So if you're pressing forward an attack, you use a momentum based one, and if you stand still and press A, then you've got a standstill basic attack. Now the trade-off for this power is that it does take a tiny portion off of your health. A small thing you wouldn't even notice really at first, but when you get down to your health and you're desperate just to kill that boss, you have to weigh out whether you want to use that special attack or not, whether it's worth the extra little damage you take. It's a wonderful little addition, and it just not overly complicates the combat, but it does make it a bit more interesting. The setup for these levels are the exact same as Streets of Rage 1. 8 stages, 6 bosses, and with the earlier bosses becoming regular enemies as you go on in the later stages. And then obviously you got the big bad Mr. X on level 8. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I feel like that's a phrase that really fits with this setup of this game, and even these levels. It takes the basic premise of the previous game and improves everything. From the streets of the city, to the amazing views from the bridge, to the sandy beaches. The levels are so varied and they just look incredible, and it makes you excited to see where the game's going to take you next. And even if you know where the game's going to take you next, everybody has a favourite level in this game, and I think that's the beauty of Streets of Rage 2. Streets of Rage 2, in summary, is a masterpiece. Is it perfect? No, there's a couple issues here and there. Some of the enemies can be a real ball ache to take down. But other than that, it takes Streets of Rage 1 and it just perfects what it started. Yuzo Koshihiro really goes above and beyond. And when he's doing concerts, in this day and age, 20 years after the game's release, just with the soundtrack, you know you've done something right. The game's soundtrack could easily be played in clubs and pubs, and it wouldn't even sound out of place. Everybody has a favourite track, everybody has a favourite song, and with me is no exception. The opening song on the first level for me will always be the best. Streets of Rage 2 was one of my first introductions to the Sega, and my god, is one that stuck with me forever. Nobody expected, but everyone got a sequel to Streets of Rage 2, and the main question everybody had was, would this be as good as Streets of Rage 2? You saw the leap from 1 to 2, the excitement was high. Time to see if the leap from 2 to 3 was just as big, or if it really was just the shoes that were too big to fill. Streets of Rage 3, or Bare Knuckle 3 again as it was known in Japan, released in 1994. Where to even begin with this one? I just want to start off by saying that this is a great game, and it's definitely worth the name Streets of Rage. But for some reason, I just feel like it falls a little short considering Streets of Rage 2 was legendary beforehand. But it also depends on which version of the game you play. And yes, while you may not realise it, there are two very different games from the Japanese version to the European and US release. So let's start everything there. In the original Japanese story of the game, the Syndicate test one of their Rakushin bombs, which is basically a nuclear bomb, killing 300,000 people and injuring 80,000 more, and more bombs have been planted in the city of Oakwood. Your mission of the game is to go around the city to find the bombs placed around the city, rescue General Ivan Petrov of the neighbouring Lima Nations, who is invited to the White House for peace talks and suddenly went missing, captured by Mr. X, who plans to replace him and other key members of the city with robot duplicates to finally take over the city and start a war. Soon after these events, Axel and Blaze were contacted by a mysterious man named Gilbert Zahn, who claims to be the man who invented the Rakushin, but claims his research is being used by the powers who intend to use it for destructive purposes, the Syndicate. So Axel, Blaze, Dr. Zahn, and Skate head out the city to put an end to the Syndicate once and for all. Now, let's compare this incredibly intense plot to the US and the European version. Despite having been defeated twice, Mr. X is far from finished in his efforts to take control of the city. He's been laying low, using the Robossi Corporation as a front for the Syndicate's business activities. Now he's brought in a mad genius roboticist, Dr. Dam, to help him replace key city officials with exact robot duplicates, allowing him to take control of the city. However, one of the researchers, Dr. Zahn, who we mentioned before, digs a little too far into the corporate files and finds the connection between the corporation and the Syndicate. But because of his previous criminal records, which is never explained, he can't go to the police with this information, so instead he goes to Blaze and tells her the Syndicate's plan to capture and replace the Chief of Police. So the general from the previous Japanese version is replaced by the Chief of Police of the city. Blaze quickly sends word to Axel and Adam to tell them about what's going on. Axel quickly responds and says he'll be there, but Adam has obligations to the police force and he can't make it. So he sends his kid brother, Skate, and together they will work together to stop the bombings and put a stop to the Syndicate once and for all. Did you follow that? Did any of that sink in? While the European and the US versions really simplified, a lot of what ties into the levels suddenly no longer makes sense. For whatever reason, Blaze automatically knows where to go next for one of the levels. It doesn't tie in properly, because they wanted to keep the plot simple and more accessible for everyone rather than nuclear bomb plots, and it got really complicated. The way I could describe it is if Streets of Rage 3 was trying so hard to be like an action-adventure thriller movie rather than just a couple of fun hours in an arcade home console game. Like the rebellious teenage years trying to be taken seriously. But that doesn't even get into the fact that there are three, count them, 3 different endings. So, spoilers, duh. When you get to the end of the game, if you save the Chief in time and you defeat Robot Y in the allotted time, you get the true happy ending, the real ending of the game. If you get ending 2, the Chief dies, you do not save him in time. You go to the town hall and then you defeat Shiva, who is impersonating the Chief of Police, and Mr. X is still alive and plotting his next scheme. So it's a very ambiguous ending. And then you have the real bad ending, ending number 3. You save the Chief of Police, but you do not manage to defeat Robot Y in time. All of the bombs dotted around the city get detonated because nobody knows where they are, and the city is destroyed. That is the worst ending. This is absolutely nuts. I feel like they added the endings to give players more replay value, but when the game feels tedious and gimmicky and, well, cheap, it just doesn't make the game fun anymore. Oh, I forgot. Secret ending number 4. I forgot about this one. So, if you try to beat the game on easy mode, because the Japanese version of normal is this game's easy. So the European version, the normal mode of the European version, is on the hard setting. So you're already at a disadvantage. Never mind the fact that they added in artificial difficulty, like the enemies do more damage to you and they have more health. It gets cheap as fuck. So when you try and play on easy mode in the European version, which is my version, the game tells you play like a rookie and you have to try harder. So I did try on normal. I tried to beat the game on normal and I got my ass handed to me again and again and again. So I thought, nah. And I cheated and I'm not sorry. So here's how I did it, so if you want to do it this way, then you can play it how it's meant to be played on the regular difficulty. So on the main menu, hold start, up and B all at the same time. And when you hover over the options menu, you press C to go into the menu and you'll hear a clicking noise. You'll hear a special jingle. And then you can choose the easy difficulty and go into level 6 to bypass the game's middle finger on level 5. So you can play the game as way it's meant to be played without being penalised. So you can enjoy that. That's the story, that's the main crux of the game. But I want to focus now on the actual gameplay itself, so let's dive right in. There's been a lot of really, really weird changes in this game. I don't think you understand that this game almost feels completely different to what was released in Japan. A lot of the character models have had palette swaps, a lot of the colours are different. And the female enemies have been covered up, if you will. They were considered too sexual looking in nature, even though they were wearing tops and skirts. They were showing too much skin. Even the main character's clothes have been colour swapped, and I'm not sure why. Maybe I feel like it was to differentiate itself from the Japanese version. There were a few more differences that I could go into, but that would just be nitpicking. But none were more notorious than the removal of a certain mini-boss. Oh no. Oh no. This is Ash. If you need to ask why he was removed from the game for being an obviously offensive depiction of homosexuality, then allow me to tell you that he was removed from the game for being an obvious defensive depiction of homosexuality. He becomes playable if you do a certain code at a certain time in the Japanese version, and he does have stupid strength in his punches. He's not worth it though. It's really... he's not a fun character to play as. However, kicking the fuck out of a kangaroo, not a single problem. Censorship is weird. But let's move on to something more familiar. The playable characters. And we have 4 once again to choose from, with 1 wild card. So we'll start with Skate. Adam's younger brother makes his return, albeit slightly older. He basically has the same moveset as before. He's faster than everyone, but he's also the weakest. So he's more a character you play for more expert players. And then you have the wildcard entry, Dr. Zan. I would describe Dr. Zan like if Hulk Hogan was into science and was a cyborg and could channel electric currents through his stretchy arms like Dhalsim and go Super Saiyan. You'd think he'd be the strongest, a 6'7" cyborg, but he's not the strongest character. He's second behind Axel in this game. He does have the best reach and a dashing charge as his special attack, so he does have his uses. Then we have Blaze, and I feel like my jokes on Blaze have been run into the ground, so I'll just move past the jokes and we'll talk about... Wait a minute. Is that boob jiggle animation? Holy sweet mother of pixels, how did I never notice that? God bless you, you Japanese perverts. Anyway, she's the most balanced, as always, and is the best middle ground character for anyone to play as. And then finally, my personal favourite character and the resident badass of the game, Axel. Strangely enough, he's the strongest out of everyone this time, and I feel like that's because of his legacy. He's stronger than the 6'7" crazy cyborg Hulk Hogan. He's got the exact same moveset as before, there's absolutely no surprises here, and it's just a complete air of familiarity. As I said, there are bonus characters you can go through special means. So if you defeat Rue's handler, you can play as Rue the kangaroo. Ash, as I mentioned, the incredibly offensive homosexual character, but you can only play as him in Japan. In the Xbox Sega Vintage Collection, you can swap between the Japanese, European, and American versions of the game, so you can finally play and fight this horrifically offensive character. And Shiva, Mr. X's hired muscle. I did not know that you could play as Shiva in Streets of Rage 2, and he was incredibly powerful. I never knew that. But you can play him again in this version, but he's weakened a lot. He's a lot more like a regular character. Everyone has their own special playstyle, as I mentioned, and everyone has their own special attacks, so everybody feels unique. So it's got a lot of choice for you to figure out your special favourite characters. A new mechanic in this game is that everybody can run, and it also means you can roll up and down the sides of the level, which is really an essential skill to survive this game. And I use the word survive in every possible meaning of the word. This is a survival game because of the difficulty mess up. And it wasn't just that. A lot of the enemies felt cheap, and it felt like you were spamming your special attacks, which now have a bar at the top of the screen so you can safely use them without hurting yourself. But because they added health bars to the enemies and they do more damage to you than they should do, the game gets to a point where it just doesn't feel fun anymore, and it just feels like a grind, and you should never get to that point. The last thing I want to talk about, because if I talk about anything else in this retrospective, we're going to be here for hours. So the last thing I want to talk about is the music. And as always, it's exceptional. Yuzo Koshiro was not alone in this version of the game. He had the help from a composer called Motohiro Kawashima, and this team has officially been confirmed to be working on the soundtrack for Streets of Rage 4. The soundtrack for this game is different and is easily noticeable. Koshiro and Kawashima wanted to go for a more techno jungle style for this game. As always though, it's an undeniably huge part of identity for this game. From the techno beats of the dance club in stage 2, to the crazy catchy beat of the boss stage on stage 6, it's impossible to think of this series without Koshiro and Kawashima. They're so intrinsically tied into the Streets of Rage series that you couldn't have a new game without them. So for them to be involved in Streets of Rage 4 is phenomenal, and it just makes me more excited now that they're a part of it than I ever was before. To look back on the Streets of Rage series as a whole for this retrospective, it's criminal that we only got 3 games, but I'm also thankful that we got 3 games. Some of my best memories are tied to this series. Trading cartridges with friends to try the other games out, going over to their houses with my controller to beat the games together, staying up to the wee hours of the morning on the weekends just replaying these games over and over. Playing them again nowadays with my frankly jaded adult brain, I still feel the joy and excitement I felt from all those years gone. But that's what I love about gaming. The memories of years gone by and the memories of your first real console. What are your personal memories from your first real console? Do you have any series that no matter what anyone says about them, you will always have a special place for them in your heart? Like, they might not even be good games, but you just got a special place for them, and you will always find a place to be able to play them again. I want to thank you for joining me on this retrospective series. It's been a lot of fun and a lot of work putting this video together, but I have enjoyed every second of it. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and follow this channel for more retrospectives coming in the future. I've been James from Square Go Gamers, and thank you so much for joining me on this.